I'm going to start with a piece of heresy, I think, which, maybe here it's heresy, which is to suggest that actually, when we're talking about disruptive innovations in technology, we tend to over-focus on firsts. Technologies that, when we go higher or faster or do things that have never been done before. And yet, actually, when we look back through history, we all know that the technologies that actually really fundamentally changed our economic and social equation were actually not firsts, but for everyone's. There were things like the printing press or the Model T, which is taking products that actually had been around for a very, very long time. Actually, we should be really, really interested in mundane diffusion technologies. And I understand that quote, by the way, absolutely captures that idea. I loved it, so I haven't skipped it past there. But George Orwell, actually, the First World War couldn't have happened without the invention of tinned food. Just captures that. Actually, I understand that Google have this rule called the toothbrush rule, which is that every new product, is this right? Every new product should be used by most people twice a day. And obviously what I'm talking about here is a product that actually everybody uses most of the day. It's the single biggest thing that we expend our money on throughout most of our lives. We haven't innovated it that much in the last 50 years. And by the way we make it is in crisis. So this is an unashamed pitch to say, actually, you should be interested in housing. Come on, Google, catch up. And when we talk about housing crisis, what we probably think about is massive urbanization in the emerging economies, the rise of the slums, extreme housing need, which that is the housing crisis. But actually, this isn't an East-West story. Actually, the West also has a housing crisis. It's a crisis of debt, a crisis of affordability, a crisis of quality, and a crisis of sustainability. And what that actually looks like is this. In everyday terms, this is as we experience it. So between 1971 and 2008, the cost of housing in the UK inflated so much that actually, if over the same period chicken had inflated by the same amount, a chicken in 2008 would cost you £47 at the supermarket. And that's just inflation. And we tend to celebrate this, right? But actually, you've got to be extremely rich, and some of you might be. But you've got to be extremely rich before this isn't screwing you in some way. It's amazing how often you hear people say, it's great, my house just doubled in value. But what they could be saying is, my next house just got half as big. So we found ourselves in this really weird position where in 2007 or 8, at the height of our economic prosperity, Britain was building the second smallest houses in the whole of Europe. Why was that? There's something going on in the economics of the way that we're making housing which actually doesn't tally with the rest of what we see as economic and social prosperity. And actually, the way we make housing hasn't actually changed that much. Since the Industrial Revolution, the assumption has been that if you want to make housing at scale, the only way to do it is to get big organizations or corporations like governments to make it on our behalf, effectively, whether that was early industrial and philanthropic housing, whether that was through communism, whether that was through the welfare state, or most recently through the rise of the consumer economy and things like Levittown in the States, and this inflated real estate bubble, which we saw over the last decade. And we tend to see these kind of ideologically, we accept these as ideologically opposed to one another, but actually under the bonnet, they're much more similar than we like to realize. The fundamental idea is you've got a piece of land, a single large investor comes in with a single large chunk of money and procures a whole neighborhood as a single large monolithic project based on a kind of an imaginary one-size-fits-all human being. And of course, what you then end up with is a big monolithic one-size-fits-all building because actually form follows finance. That's actually the reason our cities look the way they do, and the way your house looks the way it does. And of course, the open secret behind this is that what we're actually living in are not designed as places to live. They're designed as financial assets. They're monopoly houses. And we all kind of know this. What we don't necessarily get is that it leads to a situation where in an inflating market, it means there's no reason for an extrinsically motivated production model to be investing in all the things we see as good about housing, like having more space, like being more sustainable, being more focused on the user's needs. And it's amazing how often you hear developers blamed for this and say, oh, they're greedy developers. They're not greedy developers. This is just the economic development model that we chose. And actually, a lot of us can't afford it anyway. So the shift that we're facing, that we should really, really think about, and we've seen in all of these kind of tech and web enterprises over the last few decades, is this shift from the monetary economy, the idea that the only people who have the tools and infrastructure to do stuff at scale is in the monetary economy, to this idea that we can make tools and infrastructure for the social economy, for people who are intrinsically motivated, who are not making a house to sell, but are making a place where they're going to live, where they're going to pay the heating bills. And of course, we're being given this epic opportunity to do that in what's been termed as the third industrial revolution, the rise of digital manufacturing, the distribution of manufacturing, with 3D printers, again, arguably, for me, more exciting but more mundane technologies like CNC machines. And what these technologies are doing is effectively saying that the factory in future might well be everywhere. And the implication, therefore, is that the design team might well be everyone. And that really has huge implications for design. What that does is it radically lowers the thresholds of time and cost and skill required to deliver high-performance products. It effectively questions this idea of the economics of one size fits all. The idea that maybe in future products will be more and more like Darwin's finches. So about a year and a half, 2 years ago, myself and the others, particularly in the studio called 00, we began really thinking about this, and we began working on a project exploring what that could mean for housing, and with this project, WikiHouse. And effectively, WikiHouse is an open source construction system. It's a library of models which are shared in the commons online freely, which anyone can download and access into, at the moment, SketchUp, because it's free and it's pretty easy to use. And pretty much at the click of a switch, what they can do is generate a set of cutting files from that model, which effectively enable them to print out the parts from a house using a standard sheet material like plywood, which is widely available. And the parts come out numbered and ready to build. And what you essentially end up with is the mother of all IKEA kits. So we've got a couple of videos of different prototypes that have gone on. You can see the process going on. You don't need external fixings. It uses no bolts. It uses wedges and pegs to go together. The mallets, even to make it, come on the cutting sheets themselves. And a team of just around 2 or 3 people can put together a house like this pretty quickly, and they can make a small house in about a day. And they don't need any kind of traditional construction skills to do it. And also the twist in this is that it's incredibly fun and sociable, by the way. People get confused between construction work and having fun. And what we can begin to see in that is this idea that, okay, if we can develop those structures, what you end up with is a structure that you can then complete and develop through into houses. And of course, what you're creating is not just houses, but the capacity to make other houses. So we can begin to see the seeds of what could become a completely different urban development model for the way we make housing. So imagine that we take that plot of land, and instead of giving it one large single chunk of capital investment, we say, actually, we'll raise the same amount of money, but with many with a bit instead of one person with a lot. And they can come together and agree essentially a set of rules that they can all abide by for making their own houses, for principles, and then they can effectively start a community factory and design and make their own neighborhood. And it's a neighborhood made as a place to live, right? It's designed as the place where you're going to be bringing up your kids. And so there's no reason to make the ceilings lower, to take out the storage. And actually, fundamentally, who else is going to invest in putting more insulation in the walls if not the person who's going to be buying the energy over the next 10 years? And what we're creating here is actually not about, it's not about a kind of market versus non-market. What we're actually creating here is a market which is fundamentally about a different kind of product, which is as different as a product as a hot dinner is different from an insurance policy, even though they both look like houses. So actually, I would suggest that the total future scale of the market for houses as places to live in, procured by their users, will be so huge on the long run that it will make the total size of our existing property industry feel pretty tawdry by comparison. And of course, the system is extremely replicable. And that's the power of it. We only need to do one thing once, then immediately someone can take it, adapt it, and share it. And so you can create whole neighborhood development models where suddenly you're radically lowering the thresholds for other people to take neighborhoods and develop them for themselves. And the twist is that actually this isn't new. This isn't high tech. This is actually how we built cities for hundreds of years. And the only difference is now we've got a web connection, and it's a really big connection. So the project is all completely open. And we're very keen to point out, we're still in very early days of development. And we've just got, for the first time, the first few teams who are really beginning to take this project and drive it. So we're working with an amazing group who are setting up a kind of community maker factory in one of Rio's favelas. One of the most exciting teams is a team in WikiHouse, New Zealand, in Christchurch, where they're addressing with effectively the failure of a capital-led development model to respond to the Christchurch earthquake recovery. And the twist is this, if I haven't persuaded you of anything so far, which is that actually when we think about it, we talk a lot about smart cities, about the city of the 21st century. But the reality is that the fastest growing cities globally right now are not made by formal development capital-led projects. They're self-made cities. That's the reality. Those are just the maths. So actually, if we're serious about tackling problems like climate change, if we're serious about international and urban development, actually the only way of solving these issues is going to be by diffusing these solutions through open models. The traditional development model isn't going to work because simply there isn't going to be enough debt in the world to finance it. So what we think we're doing, and we're one of many interesting teams who are just beginning to tinker around open hardware projects, but what we think we're doing collectively is beginning to found a global commons of solutions for easily fabricated, replicable, low-cost, high-performance solutions, not just to things like structure, but to things like off-grid energy and to sanitation, effectively a Wikipedia for stuff. That's something I think you should be really, really interested in. And I want to just quickly finish, because we're in a room full of incredibly interesting and smart people, by going off-piste and speculating on 5 interesting open hardware technologies that I think could be super disruptive in the next few decades. This is one we're already working on, and guess what? It's really mundane. It's just high-performance windows. But actually, these cost a huge amount right now. High insulation windows. And so we're trying to develop a product which can be made for a fraction of the current market cost. We've already heard about things like water infrastructure, right? But rethink this whole idea of leapfrogging infrastructure, which we're very, very familiar with. Actually, let's build the infrastructure and the tools to do that. So off-grid infrastructure won't just include things like sanitation and electricity and energy. It will also include things like recycling. By 2025, I think 550 million more people are going to be joining the middle classes in India, and a lot of them are going to want to use air conditioning. So actually, there are worse problems you could be working on right now than a low-cost, replicable, solar-powered air conditioning unit. Fuel. There's been a lot of really interesting experiments going on around biofuels and algae production. And again, what they come up against again and again is that they can only diffuse as far as the market economy will allow them to. Imagine if we can develop systems and tools that would allow anyone to create essentially a fuel farm on their own roof and develop like maybe a liter of fuel a day. Imagine, don't see this as technology, but imagine the socioeconomic impact, how that would change the political sphere in terms of foreign policy and so forth. And finally, I would say that in the great Venn diagram of people interested in farming and permaculture and people interested in robotics, there is not much of an overlap. But there needs to be, and I think there will be, and there's a beginning to be. This is going to be massively important when we start talking about how we're going to produce large-scale food in the future, with a shrinking rural population, with effectively increasing costs of oil potentially, or more volatile costs of oil, effectively scaling organic permacultural methods around farming. But the underlying message behind these that we're really interested in is that it's not about the product. It's about the political economy that they sit in. If we're really seriously interested in this idea of sharing these capabilities, if we're really seriously interested in the idea, as I put it, that actually in the 20th century, a lot of development came around the idea that we would, the Design's great project was democratizing the right to consume. That was Henry Ford, IKEA. That's what we did. That was Coca-Cola. I think what these technologies are beginning to do is share the idea, or make it real, that we will democratize the right to produce. And that is a really, really potentially disruptive element in terms of really rethinking civic democracy at a time when actually the traditional institutions of the market and the state are struggling to provide, to deliver on that promise of welfare. But what's interesting for us is that actually the governance and the transparency that lie behind these products is really, really important. We can't say we are democratizing unless the ownership and the sharing of those assets genuinely is democratic. And that's, for us, a kind of really interesting open question. Thank you very much.